The Ozark sisters who tricked their boyfriends into swimming in the lake and then drowned them. The letter, which was stained with blood and hidden in a dead preacher's Bible for months, said that, "There are 43 young men who are missing, and they all say they moved west for work. But Thomas Becket did not go west." At midnight, he barely got away from the beautiful Whitmore sisters, gasping and clawing his way out of Lake Ozark's dark waters. The letter told everything: how Lily and Rose smiled as they held him down, and how they let him go when voices echoed across the water. Someone who had been counting the dead had put 43 memorial stones by the shore. The whole town knew the truth. The sheriff was aware. The pastor knew. Even the families who took Whitmore's money knew their sons were fishing. But why would two sisters who went to church become the most dangerous killers in Missouri history? And what happens when the only person who is willing to talk finds out that stopping them will cost her everything she has left? As Sarah Mae Thornton knelt next to her father's wooden chest, the morning light came through the dusty windows of the parsonage. Her hands were shaking as she tried to untangle the leather straps that had been untouched since his burial 3 weeks earlier. As she lifted the heavy lid, the smell of old leather and fading ink filled the air. Inside were the carefully collected things that made up a minister's life: sermons tied together with twine, letters to church officials, and his worn Bible resting at the bottom like a foundation stone. She had come to find comfort, maybe a last sermon to read in his careful handwriting, something to ease the hollow ache that had settled in her chest since he died. Instead, she found a letter that would change everything she thought she knew about the man who had raised her, to see the good in everyone and the right thing to do in every situation. The envelope was stuck between the Bible's back cover and binding. It was sealed with red wax that had cracked over time. Her father's unique handwriting spelled out her name on the front, but in a different color ink it said, "Only if something happens to me." Sarah Mae's heart raced as she broke the seal and opened the letter. It was a single sheet of paper with not her father's writing on it, but the frantic scrawl of someone else. The letter started with, "My name is Thomas Becket, and I am dying. Not from any illness that can be cured with prayer or medicine, but from the fear that fills my chest every time I close my eyes and see their faces in the water." Sarah Mae sank into her father's reading chair, the paper shaking in her hands as she read on. "I came to Lake Ozark 3 months ago, looking for work at the Whitmore lumber mill. I found it, as well as the attention of the 2 most beautiful women I had ever seen. Lily and Rose Whitmore welcomed me with smiles that could melt a winter's heart, and I thought I was the luckiest man in Missouri." The letter told how the sisters had flirted with Thomas during Sunday service by touching him lightly and looking at him in a way that made him feel special. They had also asked him to go for walks along the lakeshore in the evening, and their soft conversation had slowly turned into suggestions of midnight swims in the hidden cove, where the water was deep and the moonlight danced on the surface like scattered silver coins. "I should have known," Thomas wrote, and his handwriting got worse with each line. "I should have wondered why 2 beautiful and powerful women would be interested in a drifter like me, why they wanted to meet in secret, and why they always talked about the lake as if it had some special magic that could only be felt in the dark." Sarah Mae's breath caught as she read Thomas's story of that last night. The sisters led him through the woods to the hidden cove, where their white dresses looked like ghosts in the moonlight as they waded into the water ahead of him, he wrote. "They were laughing, such sweet, musical laughter, that I followed without question, even when the water reached my chest. Even when I realized we had waded far deeper than any reasonable swim would require." Sarah Mae's stomach turned as she read the rest of the story. How the laughter had stopped so suddenly. How Lily's hands had suddenly gripped his shoulders while Rose pushed down on his head, and how the water had filled his lungs as he fought against their surprising strength. "They kept me down until everything went black," Thomas went on. "And the only thing that saved my life was the sound of voices calling across the water. They let me go then, and helped me to shore, as if they had saved me instead of drowning me. They told anyone who asked that poor Thomas had almost drowned himself by swimming alone in dangerous waters." The letter went on to say that Thomas had tried to tell Sheriff Morton what had happened, but the sheriff had told him he was crazy because he had almost drowned. "The sheriff told me I should be thankful the Whitmore sisters were there to save me," Thomas wrote. He said that spreading wild stories about such respected members of the community would only make me look bad and cost me my job at the mill. Sarah May's hands shook as she read the last part of the letter. I'm leaving Lake Ozark tomorrow, but I know it won't help me. The fear they put in my chest has grown like a cancer, and I can't sleep, eat, or think of anything but the feeling of water filling my lungs while they smile down at me through the darkness. But I have to tell someone the truth before I leave. And Reverend Thornton has always been a man who believes in speaking out against wrongs. If something happens to me on the way west, and my body is found floating in a river far away, know that it was not an accident or suicide. It was the work of the beautiful Whitmore sisters, who collect young men like flowers and throw them away when they are tired of watching them die. Sarah May set the letter down with shaking hands and picked up the local newspaper she had saved from the week Thomas supposedly left town. In the short community notes section, it said, Thomas Beckett, who had just started working at Whitmore Lumber, has left Lake Ozark to look for work in the Western Territories. We hope he does well in what he is doing. She thought of the other young men who had supposedly moved west over the past 2 years. Handsome strangers who had arrived seeking work and disappeared just as quietly. Always with the same explanation. Always without saying goodbye to anyone but the Whitmore family who had employed them. 43 names came to mind. 43 faces she had seen in church or at community gatherings. 43 men who had simply vanished into the vast expanse of America's frontier, leaving behind only the brief newspaper notices that marked their supposed departures. Sarah May held Thomas Beckett's letter to her chest and felt the weight of terrible understanding settle over her like a burial shroud. Her father had known, and he had chosen to stay quiet. Sarah May spent 3 sleepless nights staring at Thomas Beckett's letter, memorizing every desperate word until she could recite his testimony like a prayer. On the 4th morning, she dressed in her finest black wool dress and walked the dusty quarter-mile to the sheriff's office, with the letter tucked securely in her Bible, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She had rehearsed her words carefully, imagining Sheriff Morton's shock and immediate action, picturing the Whitmore sisters in shackles by evening, justice served swift and clean, as her father had always preached it should be. When she walked in, Sheriff Morton looked up from his desk. His weathered face broke into the kind smile he had worn at her father's funeral. "Sarah May, child, what brings you to see me this fine morning? I hope your mom is doing better." She sat in the wooden chair across from his desk and carefully placed her Bible on her lap. As she found her courage, her fingers traced the worn leather cover. "Sheriff Morton, I've found something terrible, something that can't wait another day to be brought to light." His face grew serious as she took the letter out of her pocket and put it on his desk. She told him how she had found it hidden in her father's Bible, how it described an attempted murder by the Whitmore sisters, and how it suggested that dozens of young men who had supposedly left town might actually be dead. Morton picked up the letter with hands that felt heavy all of a sudden. His eyes scanned the desperate words Thomas Beckett had left behind. Sarah May watched his face closely, expecting to see shock, anger, and a desire to act. But instead, she saw something that made her stomach sink, resignation, and below that, something that looked almost like fear. He put the letter down and leaned back in his chair. His fingers drummed on the desk in a way that showed how long-held tensions were finally coming to the surface. "Sarah May," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something that's going to be hard to hear, something that's been bothering me for months." Morton got up from his chair and walked to the window that looked out over Main Street. The Whitmore lumber mill smokestacks looked like monuments against the morning sky. "I've suspected those sisters for the better part of a year," he said without turning around. "Thomas Beckett wasn't the first man to come to me with crazy stories about almost drowning, but he was the most clear about it. But Sarah May, you need to understand what's going on here, child." He turned back to her, and she could see in his eyes how the compromises had slowly eaten away at his soul. "Half this town works at that lumber mill, and the other half owes their lives to Whitmore money in one way or another. They paid for the roof of the school, built the new church steeple, and gave Mrs. Henderson the medicine she needs to stay alive and the flour that feeds the Peterson kids." Sarah May felt like the room was getting smaller around her as Morton spoke. His voice sounded like a man confessing sins to a priest. "Your father's salary barely covered your mother's medical bills. And you know as well as I do that those monthly donations from the Whitmore family were what kept you from losing the parsonage. Everyone in this town has gotten help from a charity at some point. And everyone knows that when you give to a charity, you should keep your mouth shut about anything that might make the people who helped you look bad." He picked up Thomas Beckett's letter again, holding it like a man holds a snake he knows will bite him. "I could arrest those sisters tomorrow, Sarah May, but what would that mean for us? The mill would close, people would lose their jobs, and in the winter, half of this town would starve or freeze to death in homes they could no longer afford to heat." The sheriff sat back down and looked Sarah May straight in the eye. She could see in his eyes the terrible math of survival that had taken over her community. "I've been watching them and writing down what I can. Hoping to find proof that doesn't mean I have to kill every family in Lake Ozark to get justice. But all the people who could testify have either left town or learned to keep quiet. Every piece of evidence points to people who depend on Whitmore's kindness to make a living, and every legal authority I could contact owes favors to the family that keeps this whole area economically viable." Morton opened his desk drawer and took out a thick folder full of papers. He spread them out on the desk like a man putting together the pieces of an impossible puzzle. "I have 43 names of men who supposedly left for the Western Territories, and 43 coincidences that started happening after the Whitmore sisters were old enough to get married. But I don't have any bodies, any witnesses who are willing to testify, or any way to go after this without ruining the lives of hundreds of innocent people." Sarah May looked at the papers that were all over the place and saw a lot of names that she recognized as faces she had seen at church dinners and community events. They were young men who had smiled at her from across the congregation before disappearing into the endless frontier of America. "So you're saying we don't do anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We let them keep killing because it would be too hard to stop them." Morton's face turned red with anger and shame, and for a moment she saw the man he had been before compromise had worn him down to this shell of moral exhaustion. "I'm telling you that justice isn't always possible, Sarah May, and sometimes the greater good requires accepting smaller evils to prevent larger catastrophes." She picked up Thomas Beckett's letter and put it back in her Bible. Her movements were sharp with anger. "My father preached that God's justice would always win, that truth would always win over darkness. But he knew about this and chose to stay quiet, just like you have." "Sheriff Morton, how many more young men have to die before your conscience finally tells you to do the right thing?" She was about to leave when Morton called out to her from the door. "Sarah May, please think carefully about what you do with that letter. There are forces in this town that are too big for anyone to fight, and following this path will cost you everything you have left." Sarah May walked home in the afternoon heat, feeling like Sheriff Morton's words were weighing her down. That night, she sat on the front porch of the parsonage and looked out at Lake Ozark. The water's surface reflected the fading light, like a mirror that held too many secrets. She counted the stones along the shore, 43 small rocks arranged in a pattern she had never noticed before, put there by someone who had been keeping track of the dead while the living chose to ignore them. Before dawn the next day, Sarah May went back to the lakeshore with a lantern and her father's fishing rod, to hide her true purpose, to look more closely at those 43 stones. In the gray light of dawn, she could see that they weren't just a random scatter, they were a deliberate memorial. Each stone was carefully chosen and placed with a reverence that spoke of ritual and remembrance. She knelt next to the arrangement and heard the soft splash of oars cutting through the water. When she looked up, she saw an old man rowing a small fishing boat toward shore. His weathered face was creased with suspicion until he recognized her as the preacher's daughter. "Miss, you shouldn't be here so early," the man said in heavily accented English, his voice carrying the musical cadence of his native Sweden. "The lake, she is not safe before sunrise." Sarah May had seen Henrik Svensson around town for years, but had never spoken to him directly. He lived alone in a ramshackle cabin at the lake's edge, selling his daily catch to whoever would buy it, and keeping largely to himself in the way of immigrants who had learned that silence was often the price of acceptance. But something in his eyes as he looked at the memorial stones told her that Henrik's silence was different from the willful blindness that afflicted the rest of Lake Ozark and she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Henrik," she said, pointing to the stones, "did you put these here?" The old fisherman's face went pale under his sun-weathered skin, and he gripped the oars tightly, as if getting ready to run back to the safety of deep water. For a long time, they stared at each other across the narrow strip of shoreline. Two people who had stumbled upon the same terrible truth and were suddenly, desperately, no longer alone with it. "You know what they do to the young men who come here looking for work?" he said finally, not as a question, but as a statement that was heavy with the weight of shared understanding. Sarah May took Thomas Beckett's letter out of her Bible and gave it to Henrik. She watched his face as he read the desperate testimony and began to understand more and more. Henrik whispered, "I see this man that night." His English got worse as he got more emotional. "I am fishing late, checking nets, when I hear the laughing from the hidden cove. I think maybe young people are swimming and having fun, so I row closer to check on them. But then, the laughing stops, and I see the two beautiful sisters holding him under the water. I know this is not swimming. It's murder." He shook as he gave the letter back to Sarah May, and she saw tears welling up in his pale blue eyes. "I try to call out to stop them, but they hear me across the water and let him go. They save him. They act like it, and I think I might be wrong. Maybe old Henrik sees things that aren't there." Henrik beached his boat and sat heavily on a driftwood log. He looked every bit of his 60 years. But then more young men come to town, and more young men disappear. That's when I start to watch more closely. I see the pattern. It's always good-looking strangers. Always men with no family nearby to ask questions. And they always say the same thing about moving west for better opportunities. He shook his finger at the memorial stones. "Each stone is for one of them, put here so that someone will remember their names when everyone else forgets. 43 stones for 43 murders. And I'm the only one who matters, because Whitmore money can't buy me, or Whitmore threats can't scare me into silence." Sarah May felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, as Henrik told her about seeing several drownings over the past 2 years, always from a distance and always too late to help. "They are careful, these sisters," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They choose nights with no moon. They use the hidden cove where the water is deepest, and they make sure the bodies sink where the currents will carry them to the places where no fisherman goes." Sarah May's stomach turned when Henrik told her there was an underwater graveyard, but it also made her feel something like hope. Finally, there was proof that couldn't be ignored or explained away. "Show me," she said, and the words came out of her mouth before she had fully thought about what she was asking. Henrik shook his head violently and looked at her as if she had said they should fly to the moon. "No, no, miss. You don't understand what you ask. The deep places where they put the bodies are dangerous, even for experienced fishermen. If the sisters find out what we know, we will be added to their collection at the bottom of the lake." But Sarah May had spent 3 sleepless nights fighting with her conscience and her father's legacy of moral cowardice. She wasn't going to let fear decide what she did. "Henrik, if we don't document what they've done, if we don't find a way to prove these murders happened, then 43 men died for nothing, and dozens more will follow them into that water." The old fisherman looked at her face as the sun rose. He saw something in it that reminded him of the idealism he had brought with him from Sweden decades ago, before he learned through experience that justice was often a luxury that only the powerful could afford. Finally, he said, "You are like your father, but maybe stronger than him. Maybe they don't want evil to grow because it would be too hard to fight it." Henrik got up from the log and walked to his boat, stopping with one hand on the bow. "I will show you the deep places where the bodies rest, and I will help you write down what the sisters have done. You need to know that once we start down this road, there is no turning back. They will know what we are doing, and like they did with everyone else, they will try to shut us up." As the sun rose over the horizon, it cast long shadows across the lake's surface that seemed to point directly toward the hidden cove where so many young men had drawn their final breaths. Sarah May joined Henrik in his small fishing boat. As they rowed toward deeper waters, She thought about Thomas Beckett's desperate letter and her father's terrible silence, Sheriff Morton's calculations of survival, and Henrik's lonely vigil among the memorial stones. Somewhere beneath the peaceful surface of Lake Ozark lay the evidence that would either bring justice to 43 murdered men or add 2 more names to Henrik's grim accounting, and Sarah May was no longer sure which outcome was more likely. The town's attitude toward Sarah May changed slowly, like the first chill that signals the start of winter. Mrs. Patterson, who had always greeted her warmly at the general store, now looked away and kept herself busy with pointless tasks when Sarah May came in to buy supplies for her sick mother. The kids who used to wave at her as she passed on her way to tend to the church flowers now threw rocks at her feet and whispered words their parents had told them not to say out loud but had somehow picked up from the toxic atmosphere that had settled over Lake Ozark like morning fog. When Sarah May and her mother went to see Dr. Whitman, who had been having increasingly severe chest pains that left her gasping for breath in the middle of the night, Sarah May realized how alone she was. The doctor, who had delivered half the babies in town and treated their injuries with gentle hands and kind words, looked through Sarah May as if she were made of glass. "I'm sorry, but my schedule is completely full for the foreseeable future," he said, not looking at the appointment book that was open on his desk and had blank pages. Maybe Mrs. Thornton could get good care in Springfield, but the trip might be hard on her health. That night, Sarah May sat by her mother's bed and watched her shallow, labored breathing, which showed that her heart was slowly giving up the fight. Mary Thornton had always been weak, and the harsh Missouri winters and the constant worry that came with being a preacher's wife and taking care of everyone else's problems while ignoring her own needs had made her health worse. But the stress of watching her daughter become a pariah in the community they had served faithfully for 15 years was worse than any illness. "Sarah May," her mother said softly, her voice barely audible over the wheezing in her lungs. "Maybe you should think about letting this go. There were good reasons for your father to stay quiet, and maybe we should trust his judgment." The words hurt more than any physical blow, because Sarah May could see the fear in her mother's eyes. They knew that their survival depended entirely on the kindness of people who had already decided that the Thornton family was no longer worthy of charity or even basic human decency. The Whitmore family's monthly donations stopped coming in the week after Sarah May visited Sheriff Morton. The small church that used to be full of people now only had 3 old women who came more out of habit than devotion. The collection plate that used to bring in enough money to keep the parsonage warm and feed the family now only brought in enough coins to buy flour and bacon fat. Sarah May had spent weeks writing careful, detailed letters to authorities in Springfield and Kansas City, documenting Thomas Beckett's testimony and Henrik's eyewitness accounts, providing names and dates and every scrap of evidence she could gather about the systematic disappearances that had plagued Lake Ozark. She had written to newspaper editors and federal marshals, to church officials and anyone else who might have the power and authority to investigate crimes that local officials were either unable or unwilling to pursue. When they did respond, it was usually with form letters that politely said they weren't interested. One Kansas City official called it the hysterical imaginings of a grieving woman whose loss has obviously affected her rational faculties. The worst part was when she got a letter from the Springfield prosecutor's office that had been sent to Sheriff Morton. Morton had sent it to them as part of what the prosecutor called his due diligence in investigating claims of feminine hysteria that might reflect poorly on respected members of our community. The letter praised Morton for his level-headed approach to dealing with the unfortunate delusions of the late Reverend Thornton's daughter, and promised that no further investigation would be done based on the unsubstantiated claims of a woman who, unformated, was clearly suffering from mental instability caused by grief. Sarah May found Henrik's empty fishing boat drifting near the hidden cove where so many young men had died 3 days after he had gone missing. The memorial stones that had been carefully arranged along the shoreline as a monument to 43 murdered men were now scattered as if someone had kicked them in anger. Sarah May walked along the shore of the lake, calling his name until her voice got hoarse, but she couldn't find the old fisherman. All she found were his nets tangled in the reeds and his tackle box open on the front porch of his cabin, with its contents spilled out as if he had been interrupted while getting ready to go fishing in the morning. That same night, while Sarah May took care of her mother and tried to get her to eat some thin soup, someone knocked on the door of the parsonage. When she opened it, she saw Lily and Rose Whitmore standing there like angels of mercy, their beautiful faces showing concern that would have fooled anyone who hadn't read Thomas Beckett's desperate testimony about who they really were. "Dear Sarah May," Lily said in her sweet voice, "we heard that your mother's health is getting worse, and we want to help you through this tough time. We could try to get Dr. Whitman to come to our house or give us some of the special medicine that has worked so well for other people in our community who have had the same problems." Rose stepped forward with a basket covered in white cloth. Her young face glowed with what looked like real compassion. "We've also brought some food to help you both get through your mother's illness. We have fresh bread and preserves, some of our dairy's best butter, and a bottle of the tonic that has helped so many families through tough times and loss." Sarah May looked into their eyes and saw only kindness and Christian charity. They had the same looks on their faces when they were holding Thomas Becket underwater, and the same gentle smiles they had given to 43 young men who had followed them to their deaths in the dark waters of Lake Ozark. "Thank you for being so kind," Sarah May said, as she took the basket with hands that shook only a little. "But we're doing fine on our own." Lily's smile never changed, but there was a coldness behind her eyes that showed the predator that was hiding behind the facade of community kindness. "Of course you are, dear," she said. "But please remember that our door is always open if you need help, and we are praying for you both during these difficult times." Sarah May realized that she was now completely alone in a town that had chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths as her sisters walked away into the gathering dusk. The next name added to Henrik's memorial would very likely be her own. The Lake Ozark Weekly Herald published the announcement of the church social boat outing on a Thursday morning in late September. The cheerful script promised an afternoon of Christian fellowship and community bonding on the beautiful waters that made their town famous throughout Missouri. Sarah May read the notice while sitting next to her sick mother's bed. Her hands shook as she realized how carefully planned what seemed like an innocent community gathering was. The outing would take place on Sunday after church, with multiple boats provided by the generous Whitmore family. All unmarried young men were especially encouraged to come as guests of honor in honor of their contributions to the town's prosperity. Sarah May counted the names of the 17 young men who had come to Lake Ozark in the last 6 months looking for work at the lumber mill. They were all strangers with no family ties in the area, and the Whitmore sisters had carefully cultivated them with the same methodical patience that a farmer shows when fattening livestock for slaughter. She understood with horrible clarity that the sisters had grown tired of killing one victim at a time, and that Henrik's disappearance and her own persistent investigation had convinced them to speed up their timeline and eliminate multiple threats in a single, devastating stroke. Mary Thornton had slipped into unconsciousness the previous evening, her breathing so shallow and irregular that Sarah May had spent the night holding her mother's hand and whispering prayers that sounded increasingly desperate in the silence of the parsonage. The stroke had come suddenly during dinner, Mary's face contorting in confusion as her left side went numb and her speech became slurred beyond comprehension. Without access to Dr. Whitman's care or the medicines that might have eased her suffering, Sarah May could only watch helplessly as her mother's body slowly surrendered to the stress and heartbreak of watching her daughter become an outcast in the community they had served with such devotion. Sarah May found it ironic that her mother was dying on the same weekend that the Whitmore sisters planned their biggest massacre. It was as if the corrupt forces that had taken over Lake Ozark were trying to take away all the sources of strength and motivation that might have kept people from fighting back against their reign of terror. She sat in her father's chair next to the sickbed, holding Thomas Beckett's letter and Henrik's written testimony, which were the only proof of 43 murders that the rest of the world had called feminine hysteria. She felt the heavy weight of complete powerlessness settle over her like a burial shroud. Sarah May had spent sleepless nights imagining ways to warn the intended victims or sabotage the outing, but every plan fell apart because she was completely cut off from the community, and the sisters had carefully positioned themselves as beloved benefactors whose word would always be trusted over her increasingly frantic accusations. She had written letters to every authority she could think of, but the responses made it clear that no outside help would arrive in time to stop Sunday's planned slaughter. Her own credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed that even shouting warnings from the church steps would only be seen as more proof of her mental instability. Standing at her father's grave on Saturday night, Sarah May finally understood what had really been bothering him in the last few months of his life. The headstone had his name and the dates of his birth and death, as well as the words, "He preached justice and lived in grace." These words now seemed like a joke about the man who had chosen to stay silent instead of showing the moral courage his sermons had asked of others. She knelt in the grass next to his grave and said the words she couldn't say at his funeral when she was too sad and shocked to speak. "I know why you stayed quiet, Papa," she whispered to the stone that marked Reverend Samuel Thornton's grave. "I know about the monthly donations that kept us fed and housed, the promises of safety that came with ignoring murder, and the terrible math that made 43 dead strangers seem like an acceptable price for your family's survival." Sarah May put her hand on the cold granite and cried for the first time since reading Thomas Beckett's letter. "But your silence didn't save us, Papa. It only put off our death and made us part of terrible things that will stay with this town long after we're all dead and buried next to you." The truth that came to Sarah May at that moment freed her and scared her. She finally understood that her father's choice had not been between bravery and cowardice, but between different kinds of moral destruction. She also understood that the path he had chosen had led her to this moment, where she stood alone against forces that had become too strong to be stopped in the usual ways. She got up from next to his grave and walked back to the parsonage, where her mother was dying and unconscious. She was no longer torn between wanting to save the 17 young men who were going to die and knowing that doing so would only add her name to the list of people who had died in Lake Ozark. But when Sarah May walked into the parsonage and lit the oil lamp next to her mother's bed, she felt something change inside her chest. A hardening of her resolve that had nothing to do with hope for success and everything to do with the simple fact that some choices define who you are, no matter what happens. She put together Thomas Beckett's letter, Henrik's testimony written in his careful Swedish-accented English, and her own detailed account of 43 disappearances. She tied them all together with twine and sealed them in an oilcloth wrapper. Tomorrow, the Whitmore sisters would try to kill 17 innocent men in front of the community that had let them terrorize them, and Sarah May would be there to see it. Not because she thought she could stop them, but because someone needed to remember their names and tell their stories when the comfortable lies finally fell apart under the weight of too much blood. She spent the last few hours before dawn writing a final letter to be sent to officials in Jefferson City. She knew it would be too late to save anyone, but she hoped it would serve as proof from beyond the grave if the sisters were able to silence the last person in Lake Ozark who refused to look away from their crimes. As the first light of Sunday morning came through the parsonage windows, Sarah May Thornton got ready to make a choice that would either save her father's reputation or finish the moral ruin that had started with his first cowardly silence.